No one expected confrontation. Certainly not this. In a private royal gathering meant to project unity, one voice shattered decades of restraint. Princess Anne did not raise her voice at first, but the weight behind her words froze the room. Every senior royal understood instantly this was not a disagreement. This was a reckoning. And before anyone could intervene, the confrontation had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What had been arranged as a routine gathering carried all the familiar markers of control. The room itself felt insulated from conflict, shaped by habits of order and ceremony that had been rehearsed for generations. Conversations were measured, smiles polite, the atmosphere deliberately calm. It was the kind of setting designed to reassure, to suggest continuity, stability, and shared purpose. Nothing about the moment suggested that history was about to be disturbed. And that was precisely why the rupture felt so violent when it came. Princess Anne's voice cut through the controlled quiet without spectacle. She did not seek attention. She claimed it. By speaking when she was not expected to, by addressing the issue that everyone else had silently agreed to avoid, she broke a rule more powerful than protocol. The shift was immediate. Chairs stilled. Eyes lifted. The subtle choreography of royal composure faltered. This was not emotion spilling over. It was intention finally allowed to surface. As Anne turned her attention directly toward Camilla, the shock became visible. Senior royals who had weathered scandals, crises, and private disputes found themselves unprepared for this moment. It was not simply that Anne spoke, it was how she spoke. Calm, precise, unyielding. The absence of anger made her words heavier, more dangerous. This was not a personal outburst. It carried the tone of judgment, shaped by years of observation and restraint. Body language began to tell its own story. A tightening of shoulders, averted gazes, the slight repositioning of those nearest, as if instinctively preparing for impact. Anne did not lean forward, did not gesture wildly. She stood firm, rooted, as though the ground itself belonged to her. That stillness suggested something far deeper than irritation. It hinted at long-suppressed frustration finally given permission to exist in the open. What unsettled the room most was the realization that this confrontation had not been born in the moment. There were no searching words, no hesitation. Everything Anne said carried the confidence of someone who had rehearsed silence for years. Each sentence felt sharpened by memory, shaped by moments when she had chosen duty over discomfort, loyalty over honesty. The weight of that choice now hung in the air, unmistakable. And as the room struggled to absorb what was unfolding, a quiet fear settled in. Not fear of volume or chaos, but fear of consequence. Because when someone like Anne finally speaks, it is never impulsive. It is because something has reached its limit. And whatever came next would not simply resolve a disagreement, it would expose truths the monarchy had relied on remaining unspoken. What no one in that room realized yet was that Anne's words were only the opening move, and what followed would expose tensions the monarchy had spent decades trying to bury. Princess Anne was never impulsive. Her reputation was built on discipline, loyalty, and silence, which is why when she finally spoke, every word landed like a verdict. This wasn't about one moment, one slight, or one argument. This was about years of watching lines crossed quietly, decisions made without consensus, and influence exercised without accountability. The weight of her voice came not from volume, but from history, from everything she had chosen not to say until now. For decades, Anne had been the monarchy's immovable constant. While others adapted, softened, or reshaped themselves to public expectation, she remained anchored to tradition, not as performance, but as principle. She understood the machinery of the institution because she had lived inside it without illusion. Rules mattered to her. Process mattered. Hierarchy mattered. And when those foundations began to blur, she noticed long before anyone dared acknowledge it. Her silence was often mistaken for approval. It was easier that way. When Anne withheld comment, others assumed agreement, or at least acceptance. But silence for her had never meant surrender. It meant restraint. It meant choosing stability over confrontation, even when unease crept in quietly. Time and again, She absorbed moments that unsettled her, conversations that felt misaligned, decisions that seemed rushed, authority exercised without the collective weight it once required. Each time she stepped back instead of forward. Those moments accumulated. Small fractures rarely announce themselves. They spread quietly behind closed doors, disguised as progress or necessity. Anne watched the institution she had devoted her life to shift in ways that felt unrecognizable. The balance she trusted began to tilt. Influence no longer followed the paths she had known. What disturbed her most was not change itself, but how easily it bypassed the structure meant to protect the whole. The emotional toll of that realization was invisible, but profound. Anne carried it privately, bound by duty and a lifetime of conditioning that taught her restraint was strength. Yet restraint has a cost. Each withheld objection deepened the sense that something essential was being eroded from within. Loyalty began to feel one-sided, and the silence that once preserved unity started to resemble complicity. What pushed her beyond that breaking point was not anger, but clarity. The understanding that silence was no longer neutral, that by saying nothing, she was allowing something irreversible to take root. When Anne finally spoke, it was not the voice of someone losing control. It was the voice of someone who had reached certainty. Her words were measured because they had been considered for years. Every sentence carried intention. Every pause carried resolve. There was no hesitation in her delivery because she was not searching for truth, she had already found it. This was not emotion overruling judgment. It was judgment sharpened by emotion long contained. Those who heard her understood, perhaps too late, that Anne had come prepared. Prepared to disrupt. Prepared to confront. Prepared to say aloud what others had only whispered in private. And as Anne continued, it became clear that this confrontation was not spontaneous, it was calculated, and aimed squarely at Camilla's position within the family. The air shifted the moment Anne stopped speaking in generalities and started naming behaviors. This was no longer about tone or tradition, it was about influence. About decisions shaped behind closed doors. About authority exercised without consent. And as Anne's gaze locked onto Camilla, the implication was devastating. Someone in that room had been quietly overstepping for years. What had once felt like an internal concern suddenly became a public reckoning, spoken aloud in a space where silence had always been the safest currency. Anne's words sharpened as she moved from principle to pattern. She did not accuse wildly or emotionally, she outlined. She referenced moments that had unsettled her long before this gathering, choices made without consultation, outcomes presented as inevitable rather than debated, shifts in direction that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Each example felt deliberate, chosen not to shock but to clarify. The effect was far more unsettling than anger would have been. It suggested forethought, memory, intent. As she spoke, the accusation became unmistakably personal. This was not a critique of process alone, it was a challenge to presence. Anne questioned how influence had come to flow around established lines, how authority appeared to bypass those who had earned it through duty and time. The suggestion was not that rules had been broken loudly, but that they had been bent, quietly reshaped until no one noticed who was doing the shaping. That subtlety made the charge more dangerous. The room reacted in fragments. Some faces tightened, others remained carefully neutral. A few eyes dropped instinctively, as though the truth had landed too close for comfort. Senior royals exchanged brief, restrained glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. They recognized the territory Anne had entered. Once spoken, these accusations could not be unheard. They implicated not only Camilla, but everyone who had allowed the shift to occur unchecked. Camilla's response at first was composure. She did not interrupt. She did not recoil. Her stillness projected confidence, but beneath it ran a visible tension, a tightening at the jaw, a measured breath taken just a fraction too slowly. She seemed aware that any reaction could validate the charge, yet that restraint only heightened the sense that something vital was being tested. Control, in moments like these, becomes its own kind of confession. As Anne continued, the sense of containment evaporated. What had begun as a controlled confrontation started to feel unmanageable. This was no longer a disagreement that could be smoothed over with careful phrasing or deferred to a later discussion. The implications were too large. Influence questioned becomes legitimacy questioned. And legitimacy, once challenged, destabilizes everything around it. Those present felt it then, the unmistakable realization that the situation had passed the point of quiet resolution. No one moved to interrupt, not because they agreed, but because stopping it now would only confirm the weight of what was being said. The silence stretched, thick with consequence. Whatever came next would not simply respond to the accusation. It would decide the direction of the fracture that had just opened. But Anne wasn't finished, and what she revealed next shifted the confrontation from accusation to open fracture. Camilla did not remain silent, and when she responded, the room felt the shift immediately. Her words were measured, but the subtext was unmistakable: defiance. What followed was not a shouting match, but something far more dangerous. A clash of authority, legacy, and legitimacy played out in front of witnesses who were never meant to see it. The balance of the room tilted as soon as Camilla chose to speak, because in that moment she crossed an invisible line that had kept tensions contained until now. By responding directly, Camilla broke an unspoken rule that everyone in the room understood. This was not how these matters were handled. Disagreements were deferred, reframed, or quietly dissolved behind layers of formality. But Camilla's decision to engage signaled something else entirely. She did not deny influence outright. She reframed it. She spoke of necessity, of responsibility, of stepping in when others hesitated. The implication was sharp. If decisions had been made, it was because someone had to make them. Anne did not interrupt, but the challenge was clear. Camilla's words subtly questioned Anne's interpretation without naming it outright. She suggested that tradition alone could not carry the institution forward, that authority had to evolve with circumstance. It was a careful argument, delivered with restraint, but its target was unmistakable. This was not merely a defense. It was a counterclaim, and it landed heavily. The emotional tension between them intensified, tightening with every exchange. Anne's composure hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. Camilla's calm began to strain, each sentence carrying more weight than intended. What made the moment volatile was not volume, but proximity, two forces pushing against each other with nowhere left to retreat. The room could feel it. This was no longer controlled disagreement. It was collision. Others tried to intervene. Brief interjections, softened phrases, attempts to redirect the conversation toward neutrality. None of it worked. Each effort only emphasized how far the confrontation had already gone. Once authority is challenged openly, it resists being folded neatly back into silence. The room had lost control of its own narrative, and everyone present knew it. What unfolded next was a psychological power struggle, raw and exposed. Anne represented continuity, the weight of inherited responsibility, the idea that rules exist to protect the institution from individual dominance. Camilla represented adaptation, presence, and the assertion that influence can be justified by action. Neither yielded. And in that refusal, the fracture widened. The atmosphere grew heavy with consequence. People shifted subtly, instinctively aware that proximity now mattered. This was no longer just about words spoken, it was about how close those words were pulling the two women toward an irreversible break. The tension stopped feeling symbolic and started feeling physical, as though something might snap if pressed further. That was when the first signs of concern emerged beyond the family itself. The stillness near the edges of the room changed. Attention sharpened. Movements became calculated. Those responsible for maintaining order recognized the warning signals that others preferred not to acknowledge. The exchange was escalating too quickly, and the stakes had risen too high to assume restraint would hold. As voices tightened and tempers thinned, it became clear that this confrontation was spiraling beyond words alone. Security teams are trained to read rooms before danger erupts. And in that moment, they saw it: the shift in posture, the tightening circle, the unmistakable loss of control. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a flashpoint. And for the first time, intervention became not just possible but necessary. What had begun as a confrontation of words had transformed into something heavier, more volatile, charged with consequences that could not be undone once crossed. Those trained to remain invisible felt the change before anyone else acknowledged it. Subtle movements drew their attention: the narrowing distance between voices, the way bodies angled inward, the instinctive closing of ranks around power. The room itself seemed to shrink, air thick with pressure. This was the moment security prepares for, but hopes never arrives, the point where restraint becomes uncertain and symbols matter more than intention. Around the room, senior royals shifted their positions almost unconsciously. A step to the side. A slight turn of the shoulder. Not to escape, but to protect, to ensure that if something went wrong, it could be contained. These were people accustomed to crises, yet visibly unsettled by this one. The danger was not physical harm alone. It was the risk of a line being crossed that could not be erased by silence or ceremony. Anne did not step back. She did not soften her stance or retreat into diplomacy. Her refusal to de-escalate was not reckless, it was resolute. She stood firm, anchored by conviction rather than emotion, as if yielding now would betray everything she had finally chosen to say. That immovability heightened the tension. When one side refuses to move, pressure builds elsewhere. Camilla's composure, once carefully maintained, began to fracture. The steadiness in her voice thinned. Her restraint, earlier a shield, now looked strained. Each breath seemed measured, each pause deliberate, as though she were fighting not just Anne's words but the weight of the room turning against her. The cracks were subtle, but unmistakable to those watching closely. Control, once absolute, was slipping. What haunted the room most was the unspoken fear of symbolism. This was not merely about raised voices or bruised authority. It was about what it would mean if restraint failed here, in front of the entire family. A visible rupture at this level would echo far beyond the room itself. It would become legend, whispered and reinterpreted. A moment that could redefine loyalties and hierarchies overnight. Security understood this better than anyone. Their concern was not dramatic intervention, but quiet prevention. They moved into readiness without movement positions adjusted, attention sharpened, signals exchanged silently. The goal was containment without spectacle. To step in too soon would acknowledge danger. To step in too late would allow history to be made in the worst possible way. Every second stretched. Words now carried the weight of potential aftermaths. Those present could feel it, the sensation of standing on a precipice, knowing that one more sentence could tip everything forward. The room waited, breath held, bracing for either collapse or control. But before security could fully step in, Anne delivered one final statement, one that would echo far beyond that room. There are moments when a single sentence rewrites relationships forever. Anne's final words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of institutional judgment, and once spoken, they could not be retracted. In that instant, silence became heavier than shouting. The room did not erupt. It froze. Because everyone present understood that something permanent had just been said aloud. Anne's statement did not accuse in the way arguments usually do. It reframed. With calm precision, she repositioned Camilla's role not as a partner acting within shared boundaries, but as a presence whose influence had outpaced accountability. The distinction was devastating. It suggested not malice, but imbalance. Not intention, but consequence. And that made it far more difficult to dismiss. This was not an emotional charge. It was an institutional verdict, delivered without ceremony. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Senior royals who had remained composed throughout the confrontation visibly faltered. Some stiffened, others looked away, as though the words themselves were too heavy to meet directly. This was the truth no one had wanted spoken, not because it was false, but because it carried responsibility. To hear it was to acknowledge that silence had enabled more than harmony. It had enabled drift. The emotional impact rippled outward. Speaking these truths aloud shattered the illusion that they could remain contained. What had been privately suspected was now publicly articulated within the family itself. Anne's words stripped away the comfort of ambiguity. There was no longer space to pretend misunderstandings were temporary or tensions imaginary. The fracture had been named, and naming it changed everything. Camilla's response unfolded slowly, visibly. Anger flashed first, sharp and instinctive, then disbelief, as if the reality of what had just occurred struggled to register. Finally, restraint returned, but altered. No longer assured, no longer commanding. Her composure became something she had to actively maintain. not something that carried her effortlessly. The weight of Anne's words pressed against her silence, reshaping it. What made the moment irreversible was its symbolism. Anne had crossed a boundary that tradition itself had guarded for generations. Not by raising her voice, but by redefining the narrative in front of witnesses who mattered. Authority had been questioned openly. Legitimacy had been challenged without spectacle. And once done, it could not be undone by private conversations or carefully worded statements. That was when security stepped fully between them, not as an admission of physical danger, but as acknowledgement of finality. The presence was firm, unmistakable. The confrontation had reached its endpoint, not because emotions cooled, but because further words would only deepen the divide. The space between Anne and Camilla became literal as well as symbolic, marking the close of something that could never be restored to its previous form. The room exhaled slowly, unevenly. Nothing more needed to be said. Everyone understood that this was no longer a moment, it was a turning point. Relationships had shifted. Lines had been redrawn. And whatever came next would unfold under the shadow of what had just been declared. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only just beginning. Publicly, nothing happened. No statement. No explanation. But inside palace walls, everything had shifted. Relationships recalibrated. Trust fractured. And for the first time, the royal family was forced to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. Unity had been exposed as an illusion. The absence of acknowledgement became its own message. Silence, once a tool of control, now felt like evidence of damage too deep to repair in daylight. The immediate reactions were private and revealing. Conversations took place in hushed tones, behind closed doors, with careful language chosen not to inflame what was already unstable. Some expressed shock, others quiet agreement, others discomfort at having witnessed what should never have been seen. No one spoke freely. Every word felt monitored, weighed against the risk of further fracture. The family had entered a period of internal caution, where even trust felt provisional. Without public declarations, loyalties began to show themselves subtly. Seating arrangements shifted. Invitations narrowed. Certain voices grew louder in private discussions, while others withdrew entirely. Sides were chosen not through confrontation, but through alignment: who returned calls, who delayed them, who spoke in defense, who avoided the subject altogether. It was not dramatic. It was colder than that, and far more consequential. Behind the scenes, damage control became the priority. Advisors worked not to explain what happened, but to prevent it from escaping. The goal was containment, not clarity. Efforts focused on reinforcing external stability while quietly managing internal fallout. Every interaction carried the unspoken question of what might leak, and how devastating that leak could be if it did. The fear was not scandal, it was narrative loss. At the heart of these private discussions was a deeper, more uncomfortable issue: authority. Who held it, how it was exercised, and where its limits truly lay. Anne's words had forced that conversation into the open, and now it could not be put back. Boundaries that once felt implicit now required definition. The family was no longer debating personalities, it was debating structure. And structure, once questioned, invites transformation. The emotional toll spread quietly. Those not directly involved felt the strain most acutely. The atmosphere became heavier, more cautious. Shared spaces felt divided by invisible lines. Long-standing assumptions about harmony and shared purpose no longer held. For some, it was disillusioning. For others, clarifying. But for everyone, it was exhausting. The cost of unresolved tension became part of daily life. Adding to the unease was the growing fear of exposure. Not just of what had been said, but of what it represented. A single leak could reframe the monarchy's image overnight, turning a private reckoning into public judgment. That fear shaped every decision, every silence, every delay. The institution had survived crises before, but this one felt different. It was internal. And those are the hardest to contain. The family moved forward, but not together. The illusion of unity remained intact on the surface, carefully maintained. Beneath it, something essential had shifted. Trust was no longer assumed. Authority was no longer unquestioned. And the future, once predictable in its uncertainty, now felt fragile in new and dangerous ways. Yet the most dangerous impact of the confrontation wasn't what happened that night, it was what it revealed about the monarchy's future. This confrontation wasn't personal, it was structural. It exposed fault lines that had been widening for years. Questions about influence, legitimacy, and control were no longer theoretical. They had faces, voices, witnesses, and once revealed, they could not be unseen. What unfolded in that room was not simply a clash between two figures, but a rare moment where the inner mechanics of the monarchy were laid bare, stripped of ceremony and exposed to scrutiny from within. For years, power had moved quietly, guided by tradition but shaped by proximity. Decisions appeared seamless on the surface, yet beneath that polish, influence had begun to concentrate in unfamiliar ways. The confrontation forced an uncomfortable acknowledgement. Authority was no longer flowing strictly through established channels. It was being negotiated in private, shaped by access rather than role. Anne's intervention shattered the comfort of denial, forcing everyone present to confront how far the balance had drifted. Senior royals played a crucial role in that moment, not through action, but through silence. Their restraint was telling. By not intervening decisively, by allowing the exchange to unfold, they became witnesses rather than arbiters. That choice carried its own weight. Silence in this context was not neutrality. It was recognition. Recognition that what was being said reflected tensions they themselves had felt but never challenged aloud. Tradition, once the monarchy's anchor, suddenly looked less stable. The confrontation revealed how easily tradition can become a shield rather than a guide, protecting influence from scrutiny while discouraging dissent. The old rules still existed, but their enforcement had become selective. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened incrementally, through quiet adjustments that felt harmless until they accumulated into something unrecognizable. In this new light, Anne's role grew more significant than ever. She emerged not simply as a dissenting voice, but as a counterweight. A reminder of what authority looks like when it is grounded in duty rather than access. Her willingness to confront the imbalance publicly repositioned her within the family not as a disruptor, but as a stabilizing force, willing to endure discomfort to preserve the institution's core. Camilla's position, however, entered uncertain territory. Being challenged openly altered how her influence would be perceived moving forward. Even if nothing changed formally, perception had shifted. Influence once assumed to be accepted now carried a question mark. And in an institution built as much on perception as protocol, that change mattered deeply. The monarchy itself stood at a fragile crossroads. The balance it relied upon between tradition and adaptation, between visibility and restraint, felt newly precarious. This confrontation did not break the institution, but it revealed how close it had come to bending too far without acknowledgement. The danger was no longer external pressure. It was internal misalignment. What lingered most was the realization that once power dynamics are exposed, they demand resolution. Ignoring them only deepens the fracture. The family could return to routine, to public unity, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The question was no longer whether change was needed, but who would define it, and at what cost. And as the palace tries to restore calm, one final question lingers, one that could redefine everything. Some believe Princess Anne lost control that night. Others believe she did something far more dangerous. She signaled a shift. A message not just to Camilla, but to the entire institution. Because when restraint finally breaks, it doesn't do so quietly. It does so to be remembered. What followed was not clarity, but division. Not answers, but interpretation. And that uncertainty may be the most destabilizing outcome of all. In the days that followed, the story fractured into competing narratives. To some, Anne's confrontation was the release of long-contained frustration, a moment where discipline gave way to emotion. They saw a woman pushed too far by years of quiet compromise, finally speaking when silence became unbearable. In that version, the moment was human, understandable, even inevitable. A breaking point reached after too much restraint. But others saw something else entirely. They saw strategy, timing, precision. They noted how carefully Anne chose her words, how deliberately she framed her challenge. how she spoke not to wound but to reposition. In this interpretation, the confrontation was not loss of control, it was control asserted at the last possible moment. A warning issued before influence became irreversible. A line drawn with full awareness of its consequences. That ambiguity now hangs over everything. If Anne acted strategically, then the message was clear. Unchecked authority would no longer be tolerated, no matter how deeply embedded it had become. And if that is true, Camilla's authority enters a new phase, one defined not by access or proximity, but by scrutiny. Even without formal changes, perception has shifted. Influence that once flowed quietly now faces resistance simply by being visible. The long-term implications are impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. Every future decision will carry the echo of that night. Every discussion about role, responsibility, or precedence will unfold under the shadow of a confrontation that proved silence is no longer guaranteed. What was once assumed may now be questioned. What was once deferred may now be challenged. There is also risk. Institutions built on continuity do not absorb disruption easily. If one internal fracture was exposed, others may follow. The danger is not open conflict, it is quiet alignment, subtle distancing, decisions made with memory rather than trust. When unity becomes performative, pressure builds beneath the surface, waiting for another release. And that is where the monarchy now stands. Outwardly composed, inwardly recalibrating. No public reckoning. No official resolution. Only a lingering awareness that something fundamental has changed. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or a prelude depends on what happens next, and who chooses to speak when silence is once again expected. Nothing feels settled. And perhaps that is the point. Because unresolved moments have a way of returning, sharper and less forgiving than before. The confrontation did not close a chapter. It opened one. And everyone inside the institution knows it. Because inside the monarchy, confrontations don't end, they wait, quietly, for the next moment to erupt. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.